Hello.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, Anne. Hello, Marie-Claude. Welcome.
Hello.
Hello.
We're just waiting one more minute to let people join, and then we'll start. Hi, Ruth. Welcome. Okay, so I think we can slowly start. Hello, everyone. I'm Lenya Via from Eurodis, and I'm going to moderate the webinar today. A very warm welcome to all of you to this very first Building Good Practices webinar, Building ePAG Good Practices webinar of the year. Today we'll focus on patient engagement in clinical guideline development. But before we start, I want to say a few words regarding A, housekeeping, and B, the fact that this webinar is being recorded. So please mute your microphones, use the chat box for Q&A and comments, raise your hand if you wish to speak, and if you experience any technical problems, try logging out and back into Zoom. It's important to note that this meeting is being recorded. So by participating, by continuing to be in the meeting, you're consenting to being recorded and for us to share the recording on the Eurodis YouTube channel. But your name will not be displayed in the recording. Okay. So today, this is the agenda for today. We'll start with a short welcome and introduction, and then I will give a short overview of the clinical guideline, practice guideline development process and how patient representatives can be involved at each stage. Then I'm delighted that we have two excellent speakers today who agreed to present their experiences being involved in a guideline development process. So we first have Gareth Davis, who will speak about his involvement in a guideline development process within ERN CRANIO. Then we'll have a short 10-minute Q&A after his speech, and then Klaas Röhl will present his experience with the NF1 tumor management guideline. And then we have a longer Q&A of 30 minutes, and at the end, a short wrap-up. So I mentioned their names already. I'm very happy to introduce our speakers of today. Gareth Davis, he's the Executive Director of the European Cleft Organization, and he's an ePAG advocate in ERN CRANIO. Klaas Röhl is the President of NF Kinder and is an ePAG advocate in GENTURIS. And yeah, I'm very happy that both accepted to talk about their guideline development journey and to share with us some of the key sort of principles of patient engagement in guideline development. So as an introduction, we will start with a short overview of the process, of the development process and how patients can be involved at each stage. You can see here that we divided the guideline development processes into 4 stages: preparation, research, writing, and implementation. And this is taken from a webinar which my colleague Matt Boltz-Johnson developed last year together with Courtney Coleman from the European Lung Foundation and Dr. Imran Omar from the European Association of Urology. And so they presented a webinar on the added value of patient engagement in guideline development. And in this context, we looked at the ERN guideline methodological handbooks that the Spanish consortium developed for the ERNs in the context of the guideline development program for ERNs. And we tried to see where they recommend patients be involved in the guideline development process and try to summarize that. So I will walk us through this shortly. We'll start with the first stage, which is preparation. And this stage can be divided into setting out what the guideline should focus on and who should develop or who's developing the guideline. It is critical to have patient input at this first stage to ensure that the guideline at the end answers to the questions that really matter to patients or that are really important to patients. And this stage includes prioritization, stakeholder engagement, selecting a topic, external consultation on the topic, forming or creating a so-called guideline development group, determining the scope of the guideline, developing the PICO questions. PICO stands for population, intervention, comparator or comparison, and outcome. And consideration for patient involvement in this first stage include, so the handbooks recommend that patient representatives are part of the guideline development group, and that they should be supported by wider patient groups, a patient advisory group, which should consist of between 8 to 10 patients living with the disease under discussion or of concern. And so the chair of this patient advisory group can be a formal member of the clinical guideline guideline development group to represent the views of the patient advisory group. It is useful to consider an open call to recruit representatives with relevant experience and to try to have representatives from different backgrounds, different countries, different health systems. And the ERN patient groups or the ePAGs can support with this. It is also recommended that at this preparation stage, patients who want to be involved in the guideline development processes are provided with relevant information and with a training, sort of a patient input training to empower them to be involved and to contribute. And it's also useful to, at the beginning, to really outline the different steps where patients and clinicians can expect patient input throughout the development process with rough timelines. This also helps to keep patient representatives motivated because there are stages where they are less involved, for example, in the systematic review. So, which is absolutely fine, but it's important to communicate that at the beginning during this first stage. In terms of considerations for involving patients in deciding what the guideline should cover, so the scope of the guideline, they can help to identify areas where the guideline is needed within their disease area. For example, perhaps a clinical trial has shown a new treatment is effective, and therefore the treatment guideline needs to be or should be updated. Patients can also suggest topics through discussions with healthcare professionals in the ERNs, through, for example, priority setting surveys or other consultations. Once the overall topic is set, the scope of the guideline is more clearly defined via the PICO questions that I mentioned earlier, and patients have an important role here in highlighting the questions or aspects which are important from the patient perspective, and also to identify outcomes which matter to patients and to rank them for their importance. So, is fatigue more important to patients than hospitalization, for example, or any other questions? The second stage is research. And here it's important to say that really the role of patients is limited, at least during the scientific literature search. This is commonly done by librarians or methodologists and tends to be a quieter time for patient engagement. So this stage, the research stage, includes the literature search, searching, screening, selecting relevant papers, building a body of evidence, data extraction for systematic review using the GRADE methodology, or where there's limited evidence, summarizing key evidence using a methodology which is called modified GRADE. And if there's a lack of evidence, consensus building. Patients take somewhat part, more or less indirectly, in this process because they are suggested to be part of the guideline development group, as I mentioned earlier. And as such, they are sort of overseeing the evidence review. But they would not be expected to review evidence directly. Patients may be consulted when GRADE is being used to weighting the benefits and the harms, the burdens and the costs of a treatment, to raise questions about the practicality of a particular treatment approach, and to help ensure that patients will support the outcomes of the guideline. And then sometimes at the end, or sometimes consensus statements are needed, or the best option when a clinical practice guideline cannot be developed or cannot be done if there's less research evidence and it's not possible to do a systematic review. And here the handbooks recommend that patients are part of the so-called multidisciplinary consensus panel to contribute to formal consensus building procedures. So this means asking a group of people to discuss a topic and to come to an agreement. There are different formal techniques. For example, the Delphi method is one of them, which basically consists of rounds of questionnaires which different groups of experts, including patients, complete to first understand their individual views and then to understand the views of the wider stakeholder group, and ultimately to reach an agreement or consensus across the whole panel. Then there are also other ways to get the patient perspective during the research stage, for example, via published qualitative literature, focus groups, interviews about the experience of diagnosis, for example, and this can already give some insight and indicate areas of good practice. If no qualitative research exists, ERNs could consider sharing multilingual surveys with the patient community, for example, or consulting the patient advisory group on specific aspects. The third stage is writing. So following the research phase, when all the evidence is collected systematically, then the work on developing the recommendation starts. And as part of the grade process that I mentioned earlier, there are large so-called evidence to decision meetings where the methodology team presents all the information from the systematic review. They discuss, debate, and add additional considerations. And the panel starts to weigh up the benefits and risks of a particular intervention and starting to question, should we recommend this treatment? And patients are really the best people to comment on how to weigh up the benefits and harms and what their preferences and values are. For example, accessibility of testing in local health settings, discomfort, anxiety of procedures, costs, and so on. So these are areas that often don't have any evidence from the main literature review. So the patient input is really vital or critical here. So professional members write the guideline, they cover the methods used, they summarize the evidence, they detail the recommendations, and patients should be involved in reviewing the draft guidelines. So check that the patient views are incorporated and their preferences are addressed. So evaluating to what extent published evidence reflects the outcome measures that patients consider important, highlighting areas where patient preferences and choice need to be acknowledged in the guideline, and to ensure that the guideline is worded appropriately, for example. The handbooks also recommend that patients are part of what they call the external review group, which should consist between 10 to 12 reviewers, and at least two of these should be patients. Finally, patients are not really involved in finalizing and publishing the guidelines at the end. The last stage is implementation, in which patients are commonly engaged. So, for example, they play an important role in disseminating the guideline and developing lay versions, and they may or may not endorse a guideline to demonstrate the community support for the guideline. So this was a short overview, and now, without further ado, I'm happy to ask Gareth to unmute and to present his experience.
Okay, thank you, Lenya. Can everyone hear me okay? I think so, yes. So yeah, I've entitled my slide a learning curve, really. I was involved with this with a colleague in CRANIO, Philip Bacter, who's representing PRO Europe NGO. first of all, I'll just let you know what PRO bound is. It's often associated with cleft palate, but it's actually a condition in its own right. And one of the main symptoms is a very small lower jaw, which can have an impact on breathing and nutrition, and early diagnosis and treatment and referral to the right place is imperative. So we realized that there was a guideline being developed. We were told about it in advance, but it was a learning curve as to how things developed. At the outset, we weren't involved formally, although there was some consultation in the form of surveys to some patients. But if we move through the slides, the aim and the scope of the guideline was to provide healthcare professionals and patients and their parents with an overview of best practice care for PRO bound and their families and the babies. So if we move on, and the main centers who were overseeing this guideline from a clinical perspective were the ones that were in ERN CRANIO. So we can move forward again, Lenya, so the next slide, yep. So we had centers from all over Europe, but not all over Europe. And again, there was restrictions with which countries could be involved because they were or were not part of ERN CRANIO. It's one of those conditions that has divided people over many decades, and we felt and we said as patients that if we could have taken the critical mass of clinicians a little broader, a little wider, we would have preferred to do so. But because of restrictions within ERN who could be involved at that stage, we were a little limited, we felt, with the outside opinions that we could bring in. However, the methodology was provided soundly and expertly, as I witnessed by, with the help of a company in Holland, who I met with a couple of times and actually were providing some pretty solid methodological input into how things should happen in terms of literature reviews and that kind of thing. It was coordinated by Erasmus MC in the Netherlands hospital, who organized the project meetings, coordination of activities, liaised with Qualicura, the methodological partner, and they monitored progress and timelines. The process started in February in the end, and it's scheduled to finish at the end of February this year. So if we can move on. I mentioned at the start of my presentation that we, as patients, weren't actually involved within ePAG, within the ePAG context. And myself and my colleague, we felt it was important to meet with the team, the managers and the coordinators. And actually we did this with the help of Eurordis. And so we had a meeting, a frank meeting, I would say, in July, which was on both sides an occasion to explore what can be done, what should be done, how parents and patients can be involved and should be involved, and really to ensure that going forwards there will be more patient liaison. We were aware that some of the material had already been put out there and written, so we felt our impact on this guideline was perhaps less than it should have been. But I think going forwards, we have learnt, both sides have learnt, and as we produce more guidelines as an ePAG group, I think things will be better. But just to sum up where we were involved, so after July, I think there was a consensus that as patients and as ePAG, we need to be there nearer the centre of activities than we had been. So if we move on to the next slide. So this was the process that was put together by the coordinating centre, Erasmus Hospital in the Netherlands. And their process was to start off with a bottleneck analysis, which in simple terms is an assessment of the needs of patients and what was going wrong at point of diagnosis and early treatment. And as part of that process, even though we weren't involved at the ERN ePAG level, there were surveys done which had high responses. And although there were surveys of people who were coming through the expert centres, a lot of the material related to issues that the patients had experienced before they got to the expert centres. And this is where we know that a lot of the issues arise before they reach expert care. It's the frontline health professionals, the outlying hospitals that really don't do what they're supposed to do. So that was well brought up in the surveys. And after that thing, as was stated by Lenya, the path to go down through the defining the relevant questions, selection criteria, literature review, research, that was all done without the involvement of us as ePAG patients, although there was the input from the patient survey, which was outside our actual activities at the beginning. And so we weren't involved until, as I said, July, and we were invited to review the draft and make comments, which we did. And as the ePAG lead, I went to a consensus meeting in Rotterdam towards the end of the year, which I found was open, and I was able to state my opinions, and the areas that I wanted to talk about were noted. And so that's where we are in the process. We're coming now to the end of putting together a final draft. If we go on to the next slide. Yeah, Lenya, that's it. So this really shows the chronology, and the patient engagement is in red. And as you can see, there's not an awful lot of patient engagement in the early stages, but I think it's something we will all learn from. And I have to say that I'm looking forward to producing a patient version which we can then endorse thoroughly, with involvement of a wider group. So we'll move on to the next slide. The actual areas, I think this was stressed as well, which is important. It was stressed by Lenya. We haven't been involved in the research. We should have been involved much earlier at the start in terms of scope and mapping things out and actually being listened to earlier on. But the areas where we have had some involvement is in the specific chapters highlighted there, which is around the counselling side, the psychosocial side, quality of life and organisation of care. And when we were given the opportunity of looking at the draft chapters, those were all areas that I contributed to. And also at the consensus meeting in Rotterdam, those were areas where I think we were able to, well, I was able to make significant contributions. So that's as far as I go with that. So just as a summary, really going back to Lenya's slides at the start, you know, the major blocks where patients should get involved in. Towards the end of this whole session, I'll be pushing up some other slides about how patients can be and should be involved in a whole range of guideline processes. But this is where I feel we've been involved here. Advising on the guideline scope, no. Ensuring on literature review includes patient-centered care. They may have focused on that, but we weren't involved at that stage. And there was a survey of the patient community done by the clinicians, and that was done through the nurses, which I think was actually a positive thing. We were only really involved after that in the questions around consensus, the consensus meeting, and we will of course be involved in a layperson's guide. So I'm telling you our honest experiences, which I think have shown what can happen, what should happen, and we have been involved in the latter stages. So I'll move on to I think towards the end. So the next steps to finalise the manuscript's been sent to all CRANIO members, including patient representatives for review. The final version is to be published. I haven't got the exact date. Then they'll be looking at local implementation. And the ERN CRANIO centres are now wider than they were. The new tranche of centres have now come in, and they do include some of the ones we felt should be involved earlier on. And we will be producing a patient version in all languages. And so the final slide I think I've got here is a summary. So the dialogue was slow to start. It became more constructive. There were suspicions, I think, which I think we've broken through. And I think it's this whole aspect of clinicians and patients. My philosophy is they should always work together and be equal partners. And I think we're still learning to do that process. And as I said, despite not being involved in surveying patients ourselves, it was recognized that the patients were an essential part of this process, and survey work was undertaken. And the results of that were instrumental in the way the guideline was produced. The consensus meeting was attended by myself, and I was able to forcibly put forward ideas and was listened to, and my presence there was appreciated. And really, as a final point, I think people in this group that I'm presenting to now will be aware that the ePAG terms and conditions have been reviewed and revised, and I think that will help greatly in terms of formalizing patient roles in ERNs, and will help facilitate full engagement at all levels and at all stages of processes. I think having that stamp of approval in terms of terms and conditions that are being agreed by everyone will give us a place, on equal measure with everyone else within our respective ERNs. So I think it's taken since 2016 for the whole ERN network to bed itself in, and only now I feel there are real solid shapes appearing that will forge permanent links between clinicians and health professionals and patient groups. So that's our experience in ERN CRANIO. And I will be putting up some slides a little later in this session to say how I've been involved in other guideline development groups beyond ERN. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Gareth. Thank you for the excellent presentation and for pioneering the patient engagement in this process within your ERN. But we have now time for a short Q&A. If you have any specific questions, if not, it's fine. Then we'll move on, and we have a longer Q&A at the end after class presentation. But if you do have any burning questions now.
I have a question to Gareth.
Yes.
Here I am, Nico Wilfraat. I'm from ERN Rita, that's immunology. I'm the coordinator. Gareth, were you also involved, maybe not, but in choosing the topic? because we find it difficult in making a priority list, because there are hundreds of diseases. They're all rare diseases. How to start?
I believe the actual the force for the guideline, the reason Feyerabend was chosen was because of the there's I think in a lot of the ERNs there are different work streams, and there was a work stream for cleft specifically, and they were quite forceful in wanting a guideline going forward. I think this particular issue was that there has been a lot of division in Feyerabend over many decades as to what works and what doesn't, and there are not that. I mean, it's a rare disease, so it's quite difficult to have consensus when you've got relatively few numbers of cases. But I would say it was probably the clinicians in the cleft work stream that actually came up with this as a priority, and then I think in the EPAG, in the EPAG,
that may not be so much as a problem as a start, because it will stimulate the thinking process, and then you can say, well, what do I think as priority? Then you can make proposals. And in pediatrics, we have used the James Lind Alliance methodology for that.
I was familiar with that. I used to work in the UK with Cleft Lip and Palate Association. The James Lind Alliance did a study on what were the research priorities for clinicians and for patient groups, and so that, I mean, that's quite a robust way of looking at research priorities. So
it's a methodology.
It is.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nico. There's also Alain who raised his hand.
Yes, hello. So I am Alain Pradel from AVML France.
Hello.
From my understanding of all this process, you have provided three output, the clinical guidelines for healthcare and clinician, but you have also provided, or you have also prepared two other type of support, and I don't know if it's a guideline or just the consequences of this clinical guideline, something for the patient and something for the layperson, which are for me different from patient. What are the purpose of the patient and the layperson output? It's a complement of the guideline, or it's just a way to give the good information to patient or layperson?
Well, I think the next step will be making the guideline in a way that is accessible to patients and their families. I think it's important also to have something, maybe a smaller version of that will be appropriate for the layperson. You're quite right. It's people who are on the front line who are not necessarily experts in specific areas. I mean, in the area of education, even at schools, it's lay people who probably need to know something basic about something they're not familiar with, so that those affected are not excluded in any particular way. I think it is important. Obviously, the clinicians will want to have a guideline that's relevant to them and appropriate and doable. Again, the whole process with these kinds of guidelines is, do centres around Europe have the actual resources to implement the guideline in full? And that's being a big discussion at the consensus meeting. So I think having simpler versions of guidelines aimed not only, as you say, at patient groups, but also at lay people is very, very important.
Thank you, Alain. Madelon?
Yes, I have a question on the procedure after the consensus is reached, because I'm from the ERN neuromuscular diseases, and we have, for instance, the international guideline on Duchenne muscular disease, and when we tried to implement it in the Netherlands, it took over a year to get it adjusted to the Dutch situation. So I think there is another step after after having set the guidelines, is to translate it to the national environment and the national healthcare system.
I think that's very good point. In other guidelines I've worked in, it can be complex putting together a guideline, but it can be even more complex trying to make it work in practice and to actually have it available and used in expert centres. Looking at how things happened years ago when I was involved in providing guidelines in the UK for cleft care, the only way we could actually make people adopt the guidelines was by saying we will withhold money unless you can prove that you have an expert team with the right knowledge and know-how to implement what's being written. So that was a fairly blunt way, but it actually works. You only give funding to those centres that can prove that they can actually put the guideline into practice. Whether that would work in every country, there's many different ways that health systems are funded around Europe, so it's not easy. But yeah, you can have the best guideline in the world, but if it's not used, it won't have the impact that's required. And again, we have to be careful because this is a guideline that's been put together by expert centres, but obviously there are patients coming to those centres from other centres who aren't expert centres, but you still want the trickle down of knowledge from the expert centres to the periphery centres in order that they do refer to the right places. So if there aren't, if you don't get ordinary hospitals involved at some level through type of outreach work, then those expert centres need not exist because patients won't reach them. So the whole aspect, it's complex. And my experience is you have to keep coming back to the letter of the guideline frequently every year to actually remind everyone that there is an agreed guideline, and reinforce it and reinforce it and reinforce it.
I think it's important also to have the patients involved in the step that is translating the guideline to the national situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marlon. And there's Claudia. Claudia.
Yes, I have a question. It's really interesting to hear, Gareth, that you are able to give such a lot of financial support to your centers, that they listen to you when starting using the guidelines you have been working on. I think this is a very special position, and almost none of the other smaller organizations has this possibility. So it would be better, or it would be important to cling to convincing the others with other arguments to take care of these guidelines, because the financial thing is not given to everybody.
No, I think the way that came about, it was when I was working back in the UK. I'm in France now, by the way. But I was, after being part of the guideline group for cleft care, there was a follow-up group which was put together by the government, by the UK government, by the Ministry of Health. And they included me and another patient representative on that group. And so that was the implementation group as such. And because we were able, through the government and through the health ministry, to say the only way to implement this is by withholding money, they listened, and that was what happened. I mean, it took a few years, but it worked. But yeah, I think if there are ways of ensuring implementation that are not financially, it's better if we can get people talking to us, to each other, and patients, as the previous person said, if there's no other way, then patients themselves, patient groups actually will have to do the footwork themselves. And I think there's a much greater awareness now about the importance of patient engagement than there used to be, say, 25 years ago. 25 years ago, we might have needed to use financial arguments and withdraw funding, but now with the realization that patient engagement is really important, then the patient voice, I think, possibly can work better now without the financial hammer that we had then.
Thank you very much, Gareth. So let's move on to our next speaker. Klaas, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Great. Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, thank you, Lenya, for the introduction. As Lenya said, I'm one of the ePAGs in the ERN GENTURIS, where we are focusing on genetic tumor risk syndromes. And the way the ERN GENTURIS is organized, we have 4 thematic groups, 3 thematics groups that cover the more common genetic tumor risk syndromes. So one thematic group on neurofibromatosis, one on hereditary breast and ovarian cancer, one on Lynch and polyposis, and the 4th group is on other more rare genetic tumor risk syndromes. I have a daughter with neurofibromatosis type 1, so I'm involved in a thematic group 1, which is neurofibromatosis. And at one of our annual meetings in 2019, it was actually before the lockdown happened and COVID happened, we had a discussion on the next guidelines that should be developed in the ERN GENTURIS, and a group of health professionals and some patient representatives were advocating to start working on NF1 clinical guidelines. So the first discussion was around the scope, because neurofibromatosis type 1 is a very diverse disease. It is a genetic tumor risk syndrome, but tumors are just one side of the spectrum of neurofibromatosis type 1. There's also about 50% of patients who have orthopedic issues, and there's about 80% of patients who have neuropsychological issues. So it's really a large like group of symptoms that those patients are dealing with. So the result of the discussion was that we will focus on guidelines, clinical guidelines for tumor management in NF1. And the patients right then pointed out that that's not, that's good, but we cannot stop there. So for the future, we want to continue further developing clinical guidelines to also cover other non-tumor related symptoms of NF1. So that was the scope, and then the clinical questions were like, what clinical screening is beneficial for detecting these tumors? So what to do, when to do it, how often to do it, what when a tumor is diagnosed, like what's the indication for surveillance? Is it different in NF1 than for a spontaneous tumor of that type? And what about surveillance? What mode, what interval, how to measure? So it's really a lot of questions that we needed to tackle and to answer. And also what we brought in, what I think was a major contribution from the patient community, is the psychosocial support that people with neurofibromatosis type 1 definitely need. And it's something that can easily be missed in the discussion amongst health professionals. But if you put yourself in the shoes of a patient with neurofibromatosis type 1 that has a certain risk to develop a large number of different tumors, that's a lot of psychological pressure throughout the whole life. Can we move to the next slide, please? Yeah, so there's a lot of different tumor types, as already mentioned. So just the tumor aspect of NF1 is already huge. So this is just a list of tumors that are all part of our guidelines. So we really are dealing with tumors like breast cancer and gastrointestinal stroma tumors, all the way to some very rare forms of leukemia like JMML. And the most common tumors in NF1 are cutaneous neurofibromas, which are benign tumors on the nerves on the skin, plexiform neurofibromas, and optic pathway gliomas. So just to demonstrate that it's a large list of tumor types. Next slide, please. So how did we start? First, there was a co-writing group that came together that consisted of 12 members from 7 different member states. And I myself, as a ePAG, was a part of this co-writing group. We then put together an extended group, a guideline group that consisted of 21 people from 9 member states, plus also a patient advisory group that were 7 patient representatives from 7 different member states. So while the co-writing group was really working on the first draft, the extended guideline group was then reviewing this draft and having discussions, having meetings. And finally, when the draft was revised and redone, we had a 3-stage Delphi process with more than 120 participants from 19 member states, including also health professionals who are experts in NF1 from the US. Next slide, please. So yeah, as I said before, because NF1 is such a diverse group and there's so many different tumor types, we really needed a very diverse and multidisciplinary team in the different writing groups. So in the co-writing group, there was that consisted of pediatricians, clinical geneticists, dermatologists, neurologists, neuro-oncologists, radiologists, surgeons, and patient representatives. And then in the extended writing groups, we even were able to get in even more professionals from different areas, just to make sure that we are covering everything that's important. But it was just a very huge task, and in the Delphi round, of course, there was even a larger group. Next slide, please. So we started to work on this in spring 2020, where we had the first discussions and regular meetings. And also this process, I want to give a huge credit and say thank you also to Matt Boltz-Johnson and Tom Kenny, who were really driving and coordinating the calls. And Tom Kenny was also extremely important for the literature review that he really did and coordinated. Can you click one more time? There should be, yeah, thank you. So in spring 2020, we started with the preparation, as I just said, put together the team, discuss the scope, the topics, decide on the tools and the resources that we're going to use. If you click one more time, there should be the next, yes. As I said before, the literature research was very important, and also to create this evidence, because I think that's a common problem in rare diseases. There's sometimes not too much literature out there that you can base your guidelines on. So it's sometimes really also a consensus of the experienced health professionals that have been dealing with this disease for 20 or 30 years that sometimes can compensate a little bit of the missing evidence. But one outcome of the guideline process will definitely also be to identify gaps in research where we need more or a better understanding. If you click another time, there should be now the writing part that started after the literature research was completed. So we wrote the first draft of the recommendations and completed the first draft in autumn 2020. And if you click one more time, we had several rounds of discussions in 2021 to really make sure that we further improve the recommendations based on the feedback that we received from the extended writing group, but of course also from the 3 rounds of Delphis that we've conducted in spring and summer and early fall of 2021. And now there's the clinical guideline draft is complete, and it's being reviewed, and we are now also handing it in for a publication in a journal. And what we are also doing at this moment is we are working on a lay summary of the guidelines, which is quite challenging because, of course, as I said before, many NF1 patients do have neuropsychological issues, learning problems, sometimes problems with reading is very common. So for us, it's very important to produce very comprehensive summary of the guidelines. And that's quite challenging. Next slide, please. So in the future, we, of course, will then go on to try to endorse this new, well, first, let me go back a little bit. There was a new diagnostic guideline published in 2021 for NF1, NF2, and schwannomatosis. So this is something that we want to also endorse with the ERN GENTURIS, make sure that everybody's aware of these, because the role of genetic testing is much more emphasized in these diagnostic guidelines. We are starting to develop a clinical pathway for NF2, and schwannomatosis will develop an NF2 guideline, which is the next big thing for the ERN GENTURIS. And then, of course, the development of a guideline for other presentations of NF1. Like I said before, it's not just tumors, it's many other issues, and that's going to be a lot of work as well. But the goal is to have, you know, holistic guidelines that cover all important aspects of this disease and improves the management of patients with NF1. I think it was my last slide, so happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Klaas. Excellent, very interesting presentation of, very comprehensive approach of patient engagement. Any questions to Klaas specifically? No, I don't see any raised hands. Okay, then maybe we'll go on with the summary, Gareth, and then we'll see if there are any further questions afterwards.
Okay. Hello again. It just occurred to me, what looking at the slides just now from class, where you have a rare disease that has multiple aspects to it, it must surely be very important to have a really wide and diverse patient input. I was just thinking that as I was looking at it. Anyway, okay, so some broader comments now. As I said earlier, I was involved in other guideline developments, CLEF services in the UK, guidelines on otosis media, that's gluea, and a little bit later on developing service standards for cleft lip and palate at a European level through the European Committee for Standardization. And in all of these, it was patients who were represented at the very beginning in a meaningful way, and at the core as well. So involved at the start of the process, involved in an equal way with clinicians, and also involved in a way that was allowed us to represent the wider patient community as well. So next slide. So a central role, every stage of the process, and patient representatives in that every body that actually develops the material. So from looking at the scope right through to writing, right through to implementation. I've seen that work well in practice. So next slide. Again, this, not wanting to repeat what's been said so far, but these are like the key pillars for me. So patients need to be involved in the guideline scope, who is the target population, developing the clinical questions, are the clinical questions in fact all relevant to the patient? There can be a tendency for clinicians to look at things that are of great scientific interest, but whether they are of that greater significance for the patient is not always certain. Ensuring literature review, if you're involved with literature reviews, is really coming at it from a patient-centered perspective and actually looking at what a patient's written, what are the patient-centered outcomes, what's being trawled through in the reviews. And where there are no gaps, where there are gaps rather in evidence, what are the patient's views? Clinicians might have their own expert opinions where there's lack of evidence, but patients have their expert opinions as well, and those are key. And the whole aspect of benefits and harms, you know, a lot of medical engagements can have a harm as well as a benefit, and it's not good enough for the clinicians to be the ones who judge the rights and wrongs of that. The patients have to be at the center of that debate as well. Need to be involved in consensus finding generally, and then of course they need to be key element of developing layperson's guides, layperson's and patients' guides, and general. I think following on from that is being a force for good, a force for change, actually having a role in ensuring that patients know what they should be getting, and lobbying and making sure that they have a bill of rights, as it were, that everyone must adhere to. So next slide. So patient input summary. This is just looking at the same things really. Preparation, research, writing and implementation. I think Lenya covered this at the start, but it's very relevant. It just shows the whole process and the key elements. So yeah, that's fine. So next slide. And patients can have quite a long-reaching, wide dissemination activity. They can not only be on the guideline committee, but as we heard from class, representatives from different countries with different experiences, bringing with them the voices perhaps of other clinicians as well. So in our case, if we felt that there might have been value in having a wider clinical involvement beyond the ERN, then perhaps through patient groups, we could have got patient groups from other countries to actually get the views of clinicians in their own countries, so that in theory you could have a very broad input, not just restricted to the members of the ERN, to provide generally overall feedback. And I think what you want to try and avoid is having a guideline that is actually becomes an ERN guideline as opposed to a patient or a standard guideline for that health condition. It needs to be a robust guideline that can work everywhere, where there are expert centers, whether they are in or outside the ERNs, and there are expert centers that are still not within ERNs for various reasons. It might be their own government not recognizing centers to be specific experts in certain areas, and so that would stop them being part of the ERN. But those particular centers who are not part of the ERN, they need to be in a position to be able to actively implement guidelines as well. So there's lots of elements to this. So it just needs to be thought through that we're talking about best practice for everyone with a particular condition. And that will go way beyond the actual membership of the ERNs. Next slide, if there is any more. Yeah. So again, this is just putting some numbers there. 8 to 12 groups of patients from different countries. I mean, I think this was nice that class was able to say that they've actually been through this process. And next slide, if there is one. I think we might have reached the end. Lenya?
Yes, I think that was the last one.
That's the last one. Okay.
I want to stop sharing. Yeah.
So that's it really. That's just a few thoughts at the end, which I think summarize what we're all aiming for, and we will all get there if we all persevere and we reach a consensus on not only the guidelines but consensus with what involvement with clinicians means to us and to the clinicians.
Thank you very much, Gareth. There was a raised hand from Sophie, but I don't know, Sophie, you're still there. Good.
I'm still here. Thank you, Lenya. No, Klaus actually responded to that one. I was asking about how when there's discrepancies between countries or non-access to certain treatments in others, how they dealt with it. But he did say it. They tried to give what the gold standard is and then allowed for variations according to countries, what they're able to do.
I think that's very important. It was my last point really about ensuring that whatever you have is makes sense with the resources in different contexts and can be applied to you can give the gold standard and aspire to that. You won't always reach it, but the gold standard should be there.
Yeah, maybe I can give a little example of what was one of the areas where it was quite challenging. For example, in neurofibromatosis patients, they are very sensitive to radiation, and some types of imaging like computed tomography, it exposes patients to radiation. So whenever it's possible, it should be avoided, and an MRI should be used. In certain cases, ideally, there should be a combined PET MRI, and that's only available in a very limited number of clinics. So we said we put in brackets, preferred PET MRI, and if not available, a PET CT. But it's just one example of how difficult it is to deal with the different, situations in different countries.
Thank you, Klaus. I saw there were some more comments in the chat. There
is a question from Ingun, Lenya, on the chat, further up.
Okay, I got the impression that the work on guidelines in ERN Bonn stranded because they were waiting for standards from the EU before they could continue. Are these standards recommendations now clarified?
This makes reference, I guess, to the handbooks that the Spanish consortium has developed. So the answer is yes, Ingun, those are there. The consortium that is supporting the ERNs in developing clinical practice guidelines and other clinical decision support tools is working with some of them already. They have their timeline. They will be working with groups of ERNs throughout the year, etc. So yeah, Luca should have a clear understanding of the timeline and the support that the consortium can give them.
Maybe also something that I forgot to mention in terms of how it was organized in our ERN. So we had one lead of the guideline development, which was Rian Oostenbrink, a pediatrician from the Medical University Erasmus Clinic in Rotterdam. And then for the different tumor entities, we had different leads. So different healthcare professionals taking the leads in the different tumor entities, and also from the patient representatives based on our first-hand or second-hand experience as caregivers. We then teamed up with the different tumor entities where we felt more, most experienced and where we could contribute the most, but I didn't mention it before, sorry.
Thank you, Klaus. And Nico, you have the hand raised.
Yeah, I just wanted to react to the remark about the Spanish consortium, and wanted to say that all ERNs can do it in the way they want. They are not forced to work with the Spanish consortium. Many scientific societies have been writing recommendations already for 10 years, so they have developed a process which is very much in line with what you described. And of course, in ERN, we have a lot of patient participation, but there is no rule that you have to follow otherwise than a good collaborative decision making.
And within Rita, are you using the handbooks or?
Well, have you read the handbooks of the Spanish consortium?
Yes.
Yes. I don't know them by
We
heart,
have reviewed
yes.
them, and Lenya has make a synthesis out of them. So yes.
I mean, many people in ERNs are just simple doctors. They work, right? And we have a lot. We're academics, so clinical practice guidelines are very important. And I think the process of choosing the topic together with patient, that's where the challenge lies more than the technique of how you do a systematic literature review, because we are really geared up to do that. So that's my point. That's why for the moment we have chosen not to work with the Spanish consortium. Sorry.
Thanks, Nico, for the remark. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Any other questions? Karin, yes, please. Karin.
Thank you. I'm a patient representative in Metaburn, and we are discussing a lot that it's a lot of work put into making a systematic review, and very often you find that there is lack of evidence. So you have to, as you have spoken about, use a consensus way of doing it. But we have been discussing that if everyone doing a systematic review could systematically list all the lack of evidence, the lack of systematic, random, good quality studies, then it could be possible to send it over to the research societies and say that, look, here in this IMD or rare disease or whatever, we have a lack of knowledge, and this is our priority setting for filling the gaps in evidence that you have found through the systematic reviews. Are you discussing that, or is it anything going on to do that? Because then we could maybe fill some of the gaps that are important for patients and also for clinicians. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's what I tried to say before. It's very important. It's one important outcome of the literature review process of the guideline development, to identify those gaps in the literature, and then to I think that will be one of the outcomes, to really see how can we stimulate researchers to go into that areas where we need more evidence, more information. So it's not clear how to best do that, but it's definitely on our list, and something that also the patient representatives want to support where we can.
There are opportunities. Just looking at the Pierre Robin guideline, certain aspects of care, there are gaps in knowledge, gaps in research, and as a separate study, I'm also involved in a cost action to do with equality of access to care. And there's one particular area where we found there's a gap in published knowledge. And so we've actually got, this is a very practical example, and we've organized an exchange between centers in France and in Germany to look at a particular technique to evaluate its effectiveness and gain more knowledge, with a view perhaps to having it as something that can be used in France. It's been shown to be successful in Germany. So this is a very practical research application that's come out of looking at this gaps in knowledge in this process. And look, if you're involved in other networks, as I luckily am, then you can actually put, you can piece together an approach that would actually increase the knowledge area in that particular gap.
Thank you, Gareth and Klaas. Some people are leaving. I'm just checking if there are any other comments or questions in the chat. No, I don't think so. Here, any last comments or questions? Yeah, Katja, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the afternoon discussion. Has been very useful for me and learning a lot. Katja, I work for DEBRA International, and you probably know that we're also involved in producing guidelines for DEBRA for EB. I think in the discussion you were talking about the gaps in research. It's also valuable to say that besides stimulating research, it's also that the guidelines have got a limited lifespan and they get updated. So what you're hoping is that in 3 or 4 or 5 years, you're going to have that new research that's going to update and improve the quality of the new guidelines later on. So it's like an ongoing cycle. Have you, so with regards to some of the guidelines you're developing, it might be that they will be updated in 5 years' time or something like that? Or when you have, especially with, I think with tumors, you probably have data coming up more quickly, so updating might take place sooner.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's just the evolvement of guidelines, that new evidence, new treatment options just change the guidelines. And we had one area, there was one, the first drug was approved for a certain tumor entity in NF1 last year. So it was really during the writing process that this drug got approved by the EMA, but it's not yet clear if the drug is going to be available in all European membership countries. So we had to, again, phrase the recommendation in a way that it does say, well, this is available now, at least it is approved. And if you, and a multidisciplinary team in your country needs to look at this and decide whether this is an option or not, or if it's standard of, national care in your country, then this might be an option. But yeah, totally right. It will certainly be a very different situation, or at least I hope that in 5 years from now, the situation that our guidelines are outdated, there's new treatment options, there's new evidence that shows you should do things maybe slightly differently. And of course, that's when we need to update the guidelines.
And a naive question, Klaas, will that be a new group looking into that, or will it be the same patients, the same clinicians looking into updating the guidelines?
Well, we haven't really discussed in terms of the setting of the group, but I would imagine that the same group will still be together in terms of the health professionals on the ERN of GENTURIS, and also the patient representatives that I assembled from. We have a European umbrella organization called NF Patients United. So I have a group of people that I can always, fall back to and ask if they would like to be involved. So I'm pretty sure 5 years from now, we will be able to get a hold of the same people.
Thanks, Klaas. Any other questions? If not, we can, or any final comments from you, Gareth or Klaas, closing comments?
No, I'm just, I'm very delighted that there's been so many people attending. And it's good to have the questions.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. Thank you. Well, special thanks to you, Gareth and Klaas, for excellent presentations and contributions, and of course for everyone for joining and for your questions and comments. We will share the recording and the slide deck with you shortly, and I will also be sending a short satisfaction survey to see how you liked the webinar. And okay. Thanks for sharing your experiences. Yeah, a lot of thank yous in the chat. Okay, then I wish you, we close a bit early, and I wish you all a nice evening, and thank you again for joining. Thank you.
Thank
Ciao.
you.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Have a
Lenya.
nice evening.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.